Ready?
All
Thank
right.
you. All right, so good evening and welcome to Physicians Research Center's second Cerium Journal Club. We're happy for those who managed to get connected to us. You're here. Um, Physicians Research Center is a company that started back in the mid-1990s as a clinical research center, and it's evolved the past few years, adding a network of physicians and researchers to our research pillar. Buds Info is our analytics pillar, and Cerium is our education program, which brings you this journal club. And you can check out our website if you want to learn more at prc-trials-plus.com. So tonight we're going to be talking about driving performance and cannabis users' perception of safety. And I'm very interested in this topic from the perspective of what is happening on the road. Driving safely is a big challenge these days with all the distractions. And now you add a product or a medication that causes impairment. So what is the driver's performance and perception of safety? So many drivers don't realize that there's a number of over-the-counter medications, as well as alcohol, opioids, and other products that can cause impairment. So tonight, we'll discuss the critical issue of driving among cannabis users and their perceptions of safety on the road. The session aims to explore the intersection of cannabis use, cognitive, and motor functions with public health implications. We have one peer-reviewed article from JAMA Psychiatry and a Wall Street Journal article. So we have three doctors discussing the topic tonight. Dr. Len Kamen from Jefferson University in Pennsylvania, who's been treating patients for greater than 30 years. Dr. Phil Malloy, who's newly retired from clinical practice in the Massachusetts area, however, remains very active in caring for patients. And Dr. Jehan Marcoux, a cannabinoid researcher and expert witness to discuss the topic. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Marcoux to start the conversation.
All right. Thank you so much. So, welcome to another journal club. And the article we're discussing today, as Teresa mentioned, was published in JAMA Psychiatry and is entitled "Driving Performance and Cannabis Users' Perception of Safety." All right, perception of safety, a randomized clinical study. What was interesting about this study is they let cannabis users smoke the product to their desired level of highness. They didn't require them to smoke an entire product, and then asked them to assess how impaired they thought they were, and then put them in a driving simulator. So this again was also interesting because they used high and low potency products, where in the past most studies have been done with low potency products, and their primary endpoint was a composite driving score, which again looked at a lot of variables because in the driving simulator they had to drive down a straight road and maintain speed and be in between a lane. Then they had to drive on a country road or an urban setting with more things. They had distractions on the side with a tablet that they had to interact with to simulate distracted driving. So I think the methods were pretty good. But we're going to go into a little bit of background, and I have a little poll question if you want to participate. Now it's let me see now it's saying I'm logged in on a different device and I can't use the poll questions. But one thing I was going to ask the group was, how well could you predict your own impairment? And I actually asked this on LinkedIn, and I got responses, and it was very well, somewhat, or not at all. And 60% of the respondents on LinkedIn, going out to many people, said that they could predict very well how impaired they might be from using products. The other 40% said somewhat. None of them said not very well, which I think this study shows that we are poor predictors of our own impairment. So, the dilemma here is that in virtually all jurisdictions, there are laws prohibiting the operating of a motor vehicle while impaired by any substance. And so this gets us into wondering or begging about the definitions for defining and measuring impairment. When it comes to alcohol, we're all very familiar with this. That's because there is a ton of research, decades and decades, that demonstrate there is an excellent correlation between blood levels of alcohol and impaired driving. And breathalyzer results correlate with those blood levels. Let's remind you, you're welcome to put in any questions into the chat. We're happy to answer them, and just let me know if there's any other technical issues. Hope the slides look all right. So driving under the influence of cannabis is different, because one thing that makes this tricky is that the cannabinoids can be stored in fat tissue or adipose tissue, then slowly released over a long period of time. Thus, even brief cannabis exposure can be detectable for up to weeks, long after any acute biological effect. So again, one thing to remember is that countless studies have examined impaired driving in relation to THC levels in blood, urine, breath, and many other specimens. And it's been constantly shown that impairment is not or are not related to levels in any measurable fluid or breath test, which makes this a little bit of a conundrum. So the dilemma is that all stakeholders in this group, public health officials or researchers, they all want the same goal. They all have the same goal, and that's to avoid impaired drivers. But how do you define impairment, and how do you enforce those regulations around driving while under the influence of cannabis in a validated and objective way? Everyone wants a validated and objective way to make this assessment. The researchers used a driving simulator. Driving simulators have a rich history in this country. The first patent for a simulator was in 1931, I believe, and was for a flight simulator, believe it or not, pictured up there, made of wood. But car companies have started to explore this. All the big car manufacturers have sort of developed their own simulator that actually might move on tracks, up, down, left, right, to give different sensations of acceleration and deacceleration. But the latest model actually almost looks more simple than some of the other ones in history, especially compared to like the Volkswagen one that looks like some sort of spaceship. The one that was used in this study was this STISIM M300WS console driving simulator system. As you can see, it does not move on a track. It's stationary. It has 3 pane windows for not a 360 view, but it's enough with feedback from the steering wheel and pedals to trick the brain into thinking you're driving. So much so that the authors in another interview actually said that people in these simulators would actually look over their shoulder before executing a maneuver, and all they would see is a lab tech there taking notes. But so that's how well this simulator worked. And so what the researchers were trying to ask are what factors are related to the impact of smoked cannabis on driving and the user's perception of driving ability. So to take us through this next set of figures of the paper, Dr. Phil Malloy, I'd like to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you. I have the podium. So we won't spend a ton of time on all of the details in this study. So let's paint the picture of what was done. Total of 199 participants were randomized to placebo, low strength THC intervention, and higher strength THC intervention. Yes, it is possible, and it's a standard thing in research to come up with placebo marijuana cigarettes. They smell the same, and allegedly you can't tell that they're placebo. I think Jehan already mentioned that when you do a low and a high strength product, if the study design includes the provision, smoke to your desired level of highness, called ad libitum smoking, then you could envision where the lower strength group is going to smoke more joints than the higher strength group to get to their level, which is why the amount smoked doesn't seem to correlate with impairments or blood levels, because people are smoking to their desired level of highness or CNS effect, if you will. All right, we'll go to the next one. The usual demographic slide. These cannabis users were subsequently grouped into those who were moderate or light users, medium users, and heavy users. And shown on this slide is the average age. You can look at it on your own. You can raise your hand in the chat section if you'd like to go back to any slides as well. And you can see the exposure at the bottom of this slide. So we'll go right to the next one because these results are going to be where most of the data is. So results can be confusing at first blush, but let's just look at the left-hand side of this graph. One of the principal endpoints of this study. The main endpoint is change in comprehensive driving score. How messed up is your driving after exposure? And this metrics were obtained at 30 minutes, as you could see, an hour and 30 minutes, 3 hours and 30 minutes, 4 hours and 30 minutes. For the first two metrics, both cannabis groups were markedly and obviously more impaired than the placebo group. And somewhere between an hour and 30 minutes and 3 hours and 30 minutes, the cannabis, the active groups started to approach the baseline. You can see that from these graphs on the left, and the graph on the right makes the point that there's a lot of variability. Placebo people, some of them drove worse after smoking placebo. And in the cannabis groups, some people improved their driving in the cannabis groups. The results are averages and means, but there's a huge overlap. I'm sure this has to do with individual variability and tolerance issues. So we'll go to the next slide. This is a really important slide. And let's look at the blue lines and the light blue line and the dark blue line first. So that is the primary endpoint, free smoking, comprehensive driving score. And then 30 minutes later, you see the poor score. I don't think you can see my pointer. And an hour and 30 minutes later, the cannabis exposed groups measured worse, clearly worse. Oh, but look at this. How about the user's perceived degree of impairment? Between 30 minutes and an hour and 30 minutes, while they were still significantly impaired, they were losing their ability to recognize that they were impaired. The difference between the light blue line and the dark blue line in the middle of this graph is the difference between objective measures of your impairment and your subjective own assessment of how impaired I am. So the bigger that spread, the bigger the difference is. So one of the main conclusions of this study is shown here, that there is not a great correlation, that users don't do a good job in identifying when they're prepared and when they're ready to drive again. So what about the light blue bar graphs? Those are the percentage of drivers at each time point who agreed that they were not fit to drive. So it's a minority all the time. They agreed that they were not fit to drive. But between 30 minutes and an hour and 30 minutes, it fell in half, even though their level of objectively measured impairments, if anything, went up a little bit. So emphasizing the same point. So let's go to the next graph. This is an important one if you review this article again, just to go back and look at. So next one. So this shows, we don't need to spend time on this. This shows what every study has ever showed, is that the blood level of THC has no correlation, is totally not predictable of how well you're driving. How you perform in the simulator when you're emerging onto traffic, responding to changes in traffic lights, cars coming at you, kids, distractions. your level, of THC is fairly meaningless in terms of how impaired you are. This has been shown over and over and over again. This begs the question of, should this level be used in a legal setting to judge someone's impairment? And scientifically, the answer is pretty clear. It's no. Next slide. On the left side of this graph, they look at um, the low users, the moderate users, and the high users, showing that there's not that much difference between these groups. And on the right side, it just divides groups into the total exposure that they've had estimated by their diaries over the past 6 months, showing it doesn't do a great job, but the highest users had higher THC levels, but it does not correlate with impairment. Remember that. Next slide. All right.
So,
So
yeah, do you want to read the quote, Phil?
sure. I mean, this is right from the paper, I believe, right, Jehan? This is
Yeah,
the
so this,
office of the paper. When users control their own intake, one cannot infer the level of impairment based on the content of the product. So the low and the high THC products were interchangeable, and your level of behavioral tolerance individual or the blood THC concentrations, which we've gone over again. So next. I think these are some of the conclusions before I have only one more slide, I think, after this. Cannabis use is associated with impaired driving. And maybe you could back up and say, why do we even use simulated chambers and simulated environments? Because it's obviously there's ethical issues with getting people stoned and intentionally impaired and then turning them out on public roads. So the consensus is that these metrics, comprehensive driving scores in these chambers, are accurate and ethical. People are not good judges of their impairment and when it's safe to resume driving. And there is no biologic measurement of blood, saliva, tears, urine, breath that can predict impairment. I would like to repeat that. Next slide. But wait, there's more. Uh, I would just put this slide up to make sure that everyone here knows that this is an area of intense interest. Go to clinicaltrials.gov and put in the params cannabis and driving and see what people are doing right now. So the first study is looking at an infrared device that can measure your impairment, how well your sensory and motor parts of the brain are talking to each other after cannabis exposure, which has the potential to be something real and not dependent on blood levels, urine tests. And the second reference is a reference on an area of active research on enhanced field sobriety tests, specially trained law enforcement officers who go away for weeks and weeks and are highly trained in giving roadside sobriety tests. And how good is that? So we're not going to go over all this stuff now, but just want you to know that all this stuff is happening in this field right now.
all right. Thank you, Dr. Malloy. Dr. Kamen is going to take over from here, giving us a little bit of overview on his take on some of this information, as well as about some of the stuff that Dr. Malloy just mentioned about some of the research on these field sobriety tests. So take it away, Dr.
Okay,
Kamen.
thanks, Jehan, and lovely analysis there, Phil. It's a difficult. Some of the graphs are difficult to visualize and take all that information that you just gave us. That slide is driving me impaired, so I did use that to illustrate that same GIF to illustrate. No, it's enough. You showed it. To illustrate what happens when patients take opiates long term is that their judgment is impaired, and it has to do with the connections between the ventral tegmental area of the brain and the frontal cortex, and that the impulses and its pretty much dopamine driven, are impaired. The dopamine levels are impaired, and therefore the frontal cortex makes bad judgments about what to do when it comes to opioids. But I suspect under further physiologic investigation, the same thing will happen with other substances that impair our level of consciousness, that it's slowing down the executive function of the frontal cortex to make good judgment. Now, I thought the analysis here as well is coming down to the fact that, you know, blood levels don't seem to show much. We don't have a perfect sobriety test like we do for alcohol, and I guess that's been validated. I'm assuming that's all been very well validated by this time. We don't have that because, as Phil said, there's a residuum of a THC in our fat and lipid levels, when especially with prolonged smoking or a prolonged exposure. So what do we have? We have well, people who are driving under the influence and they're showing impairment. The laws are definitely needing to be somehow codified, and I am looking at this and saying that, you know, perhaps the best way of knowing whether somebody is impaired is by giving them a driving test. I don't know if there's a little gadget that will be able to tell us, but more important, it may be that the sophistication of a driving simulator, as Jahan was showing, has increased over the years. And now all that gadgetry is in some of our vehicles. And whether they're electronic or not, I don't think it really matters. I think they can put sensors in that, like my car tells me that I'm not gripping the steering wheel with two hands. You need to grip the steering wheel with two hands. And that my vehicle does tell me that. And furthermore, it will tell me that I'm not focusing and paying attention. And I suspect some of the more advanced vehicles, you know, can look at your retina and actually see that you're drifting and not paying attention. So that may be the future, because we don't have other tools at the right moment that will tell us as accurately as we can with alcohol. Next slide there. There is a definite trend, a doubling of prevalence of driving under the influence of cannabis being picked up. It's a doubling, but it's still on the low side from almost a decade and a half of studies here. And in contrast, the driving under the influence of alcohol prevalence appears unrelated to the medical marijuana laws that are being enacted. So that doesn't seem to be directly related. However, I have to say that in some of the studies we're doing with opioids, and as some of you may know, we're in the what's called the fourth wave of the opiate epidemic. The first wave was in the 1800s, and second waves were in the early 1900s, and then third wave was the heroin wave of the post-Vietnam era, and the fourth wave is now fentanyl, but it's fentanyl with additional stimulants and polysubstance abuse, and that's probably going to happen in cannabis as well. So medical marijuana laws, the conclusion of this study was in the US have been associated with increased prevalence of driving under the influence with cannabis, but not alcohol combined. I'm not sure where we're going with that. Next slide. I thought this was a good counterpoint to the Marcotte study because Marquardt study was 30-year-olds, and it was young adults that are describing their level of impairment and the amount of material they're smoking, how long it lasts. And we saw that over 4.5 hours before those people were really satiated and felt like they were ready perhaps to drive again. And their studies show that their deterioration of function was lasted up to that long. In older adults, and I'm just going to point to the key points here on the right side of this slide, showing that there were a small group, it's only 31 users here, but they're twice the age or more than the study that Marquardt did. And their impairment was increased, and all that we measured in the first studies were notable, and their impaired driving persisted for 3 hours. So fairly correlative, but older drivers have problems in the first place. So it's too small a study to draw a direct correlation, I think, between the Marquardt study, but certainly there's combined comorbidity. I think Teresa pointed out at the very beginning of this discussion is that there are many other drugs that we're taking on a day-to-day basis. It could be beta blockers that slow us down a little bit. It could be antihistamines, anything that makes us a little bit groggy or fatigued for that matter. There is a certain concern again with polysubstances, or not even necessarily drugs that we know influence cognitive function, but just have some subtle effect on motor skills and on reaction times. Next slide there. This is actually a visual summary of the Marquardt study that Phil so elegantly reviewed. And it's just reiteration. In that study, the population is as shown a bit more than the older study. So almost 200 people. And the intervention was placebo versus delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and so on. And the findings, as again were elegantly discussed, are that there was impairments up to 4 hours in this study, despite perception not being correlating with the level of dysfunction in terms of the testing. So that's the visual of that first study. And next slide. I think this brings us to an end here. We're talking about, is there a reliable test at this time for cannabis impairment? And this Marquardt study, very recent, indicates that there are some tests in development. Highly trained police officers, I suspect there's some subjectivity there, but I think that they're doing their best to try to find this. But it's interesting that they're spending time and training officers. It's not just going to be an electronic gadget that we point and shoot and determine the exact level of anybody's impairment. It takes more than that. A human, perhaps more so than artificial intelligence. And these are the issues of the future to determine whether people are impaired. Currently, it's old THC in their system, and they're not as impaired after those 4 hours. Those are questions to be answered. Next slide. This is my last slide, just to say that, and this was a comment to the editor from another journal, whether the concern here is the cause of impairment or the impairment itself. And any impairment, i.e. fatigue, can certainly affect our driving performance, among other things. So the question I get in my office practice is post stroke or post any other impairment from the variety of physical problems that present to us in our offices. There is a question: is this person capable of driving? If they have a knee replacement on that same side as they operate the brake on, because they've lost some of the proprioceptive skills. So is it the cause of impairment or the impairment itself that we really should be concerned about, and being more accurate as to uncovering impairment, not just substance use related, but impairment by itself when it comes to driving? And as I said, incorporating this into the electronics of a car should be, perhaps is the only way to get a better rounded picture of the accuracy of individuals' ability to be optimally capable of driving. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, everyone. We do have one really good question from Ken Walski, who's a health professional from New Jersey, who's actually, I attended a meeting a couple weeks ago and learned that he actually won an award or earned an award from the state for community service and his other things related to this field of medical cannabis in the state of New Jersey. But he asks about a court in New Jersey has okayed the use of drug recognition experts, at least for now. How reliable are these experts in determining impairment? And so what he's referring to is the New Jersey Supreme Court has declared that the testimony of drug recognition expert is reliable enough to be used as evidence in a 5-2 decision. Of course, there are a lot of people who question this because it's not necessarily, it could be scientific, it's not necessarily scientific. But for those of us who are unfamiliar with drug recognition experts, according to a webpage here, a drug recognition expert or drug recognition evaluator is a law enforcement official trained to recognize impairment in drivers under the influence of drugs other than or in addition to alcohol. So I guess I don't want to be tongue-in-cheek, but do you know someone's impaired just by looking at them? I think it's not that simple. I'd imagine that there are several clues that might lead to it. I think of those old commercials where the guy opens the car door and like all this water and fish come out of the car door, or like all this booze comes out of the car door. There might be smells, there might be open containers, there might be product in the car. The person might be acting irrationally. So I think that that it can be a systematic way to check some boxes, but again, without, I think, corroborating that with something objective. Again, I'm not sure what that standard is, but I think there might be places where that's appropriate, but it might be also prone to abuse potentially too. And I don't know if we want to talk about the subjectivity of some of those tests, but I think they are one level of evidence, right? If we think of evidence as like an onion, there are different layers that you can look at. And one layer is, does someone appear to be impaired or under the influence of something? And then there's other questions like, do we have additional evidence? What can we use to back that up? But I don't know if the good doctors would like to comment on drug recognition evaluators or experts in recognizing impairment. Perhaps we've had people come in the clinic to visit you that you thought might be.
I had an interesting case. A woman who had a severely deteriorated hip, who came into the clinic. She was She was actually a peculiar person. She did not want, at the time, it was primarily metal hip replacements. They've since gone on to porcelain and some other different substances they're using in artificial hips. But she did not want a metallic hip. And so she remained with a difficult, challenging gait. And she was pulled over on I think on the Ben Franklin Bridge, which is run by the Delaware Valley, has some other police authority. She was pulled over and she was a bit of a loudmouth and was yakking away at the officer who pulled her over for, maybe swerving, um, not related to her hip, but the officer made her take the tandem walk line, from as they do for alcohol testing. And of course, she couldn't walk well because of her hip, and began mouthing off at the officer why she couldn't walk well. And he tackled her and threw her to the ground and so on, and threw her in jail. So that there was a test here that was the example of how inaccurate those field tests can be. And I hope that those specially trained officers are a little bit more sensitive to a variety of things. And of course, there's concerns about subjectivity and their bias when it comes to individuals. There's lots of things. I do want to comment that I get worried when I see a car ahead of me on in a busy traffic time in Philadelphia in the city, and there's a bunch of vape smoke pouring out the window, and you can smell it from the next car up, whether it's pot or not. And I am concerned about that. And maybe that's the best test yet, to see a whole bunch of vape smoke coming out your out the window of the car. uh, I don't know that we have any other real great tests at this point yet.
So if you have a San Francisco level of fog coming out of your car, it might there's a number of things that could be representing hazards there. But I think those are great points. I think what I'm hearing is if we go by the textbook, of how a drug recognition expert should go about their systematic evaluation, sure, it can be applied appropriately, but as with all things that are run by humans, are subjective and limited by our senses, our biases, and are we looking at someone in the middle of the night or in broad daylight, and how does that impact our assessment? But I think it's a really good question, and I think it's something that a lot of courts will have to decide for themselves. And it might come down to the curriculum and how well they're trained, and how easy is it to become a DRE? I think that's another question. What does that training look like? Because we don't really know what that looks like. So I think I would have questions about how do they determine this person meets these qualifications to make those judgments. So it might be maybe New Jersey has the strictest criteria for that, and that's why the Supreme Court felt comfortable. But again, we don't really have the information as to know what they base their judgment on. What evidence was there?
It's preferable obviously it's preferable to have these enhanced field sobriety tests than to rely on blood tests or urine tests. It's better than that, at least. And the tension is that the public is demanding that society do something to keep these stone impaired people off the road, and we don't have the tools to do that.
Yeah, and we
right
don't
now.
we want to validate it in objective tests. We don't want a bunch of false positives in the
Right.
judicial system. But again, I think that's why this maybe requires careful attention. And I just want to be conscious of time. And I'd like to just say that we're going to have another journal club. They're the first Tuesday of every month. Spread the word. I will be sharing around a Zoom link. We'll be discussing the hemp loophole and some public health data about hemp cannabinoids. I don't know if the doctors or Teresa would like to have any final comments for us, and then we can sign off. Yeah.
I'm
No, this
all
is
set.
no, this has been great. Thank you for letting me join.
Thank you so much, Otha. It's great. I really appreciate you being here.
Yes, no, thank you, Otha. I think, you know, it's a great introduction to some of the content that we can offer, right, to the physicians and healthcare providers.
Oh, absolutely. Super informative. So I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining.
See you guys. I mean, we
Yeah.
can't do what we can't do when it comes to social media, unfortunately.
Yeah, right, right.
Uh,
Thank you.
Okay.
All right,
So,
everyone. Yeah, go ahead,
yep.
Teresa.
Yeah, no, just thank you for those who've joined to take the time and spend with us. And we will have the recording available on the website. So if anyone you know was planning to attend and missed it, the recording will be available.
Spread the word to your friends and colleagues.
Yes, please spread the word. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. We are available for any follow-up questions as well. So enjoy the rest of your week and hopefully see you in a month for our next Journal Club.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Okay, guys, nice talking.
Yep. Bye.